Greetings, and welcome to the fourth episode of The Serpent and the Star, a podcast on theistic Satanism based on the philosophy of the Star of Azazel. This time we discuss death and mortification, themes crucial to our form of spirituality. Even the Star of Azazel logo is often seen with the Latin verses fiat nox, meaning let there be night, and omnia mors poscit, death takes all. Also, the sixth point of the sevenfold basis of the Star of Azazel is worship of death. As Johannes Nefastos writes in the article about this basis, life and death are equally meaningful and important events, counterparts of the great process of transformation within which the eternal consciousness has its being. Because our modern time is so scared of death, equilibrium can be achieved only by understanding the beauty of death and darkness. Our discussion was once again recorded in Helsinki, Finland, with Frater Nefastos, with Soror Polyhymnia joining us remotely from Canada. As usual, let us start with the Agape prayer. Beloved Master, in you we trust. In your name we have joined together. Ubi enim sunt duo vel tres congregati in nomine meo ibisum in medio eorum. So be with us, Master lucifer-christos, and send to our hearts and into our communion the Holy Spirit that fills the life with meaning. In trust, let us rise our hearts into brilliance, frater et soror, ad sacra mysteria celebranda. Verily. I was thinking maybe we should start just by thinking how the view on death is different for someone who's a materialist or if you will, a profane person versus an occultist. What do you think?
I've always thought that it would be easier to think that everything ends in death. I find it surprising to hear that people fear that end of everything, end of life, because I've always felt that it would be so much easier if this consciousness could just cease to exist. So, in case one thinks as an occultist that death is just a transformation to some other kind of existence, then the whole life and its challenges are pretty different, because they are always steps to something.
I was actually thinking about this when you sent out the topic about how, as an occultist, death is kind of seen more like a liminal space, kind of just in transition. And just that concept, how that's so different from, materialism, where life and death kind of ends with, well, the heart or the brain, like on a very physical level, all matter-based. Whereas, with occultists, it goes beyond matter. There's the soul, consciousness, and the thought that the consciousness extends beyond when the heart or the brain stops. So.
Yeah, it feels like the whole question is even more complex, even if it's for sure a very complex issue for a materialist as well. But like, if you bring to the table all that spiritual background, it's like it's such a deep mystery.
For materialists, yeah, there's cycles there too. Right, like the whole cycle of life, and in a very natural sense and physical sense. And with occultism, that's just kind of more applied metaphysically and in many death and rebirth cycles throughout our existence, whether it be like in one lifetime or multiple lifetimes.
I was just thinking that how my idea about the shortness of human life has been intensified when I have been coming older myself. When I was young, I had this thought that Of course, there is so much potentiality in human being. We can accomplish many magical things before we die, but now when I have all these decades, I have tried to change things and noticed that human advancement is pretty slow. Even this life seems so much more chained to that death, and our life is so much more destined to be something. I think it's normal to become a bit cynical and pessimistic in a way about human development when you are old enough.
When do you think you reach that point of being old enough that you become really cynical?
I think it was about 40.
40 or 14?
Well, both. But I meant 40. When I was 14, I was pessimistic, that's true. But I tend to, at that point, see death as something that's in a way very spiritual and distant and full of possibilities. But it was, for me as a human being, some way distant thing. When one is 14 years old, there is so much unlocked potential that we can think about many developments we can still reach here, but now it seems pretty different. How about you? I think you are not past that age of 40 yet, but does this sound familiar?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty cynical, for sure. I don't know at what age that cynicism hit. But on the other hand, too, I think weirdly joining the Star of Azazel has made me more hopeful in other weird ways. It does feel like there's a tediousness with how slow that development can happen sometimes, especially if there's multiple energies that you're kind of reliant on to kind of help propel things forward. So that can feel sometimes cumbersome, I suppose. And then that can lend its way to cynicism pretty quickly. But I think still maybe 40 will be the magical age where I go from hopeful again somewhat to completely cynical again. I got 4 years. We'll see.
I wish you luck.
I feel somewhat in the same way that I mean I have been called cynical when I was in my teens and stuff, and then I feel that I have become also more hopeful later on. But then again, there is some kind of a cynicism on the background all the time, but at least it has changed. I've been thinking about this, not lately, but I've been thinking about this quite a lot actually, and like how to remain functional with that cynicism creeping in. Like, what can a human being achieve? What can I do? Where is this whole damn world headed? And so on. It's hard to stay very happy in the middle of it all.
I just hope that there will come another brighter magical age that releases this black stage, and I think there will be. Of course, people can get attached to the temperamental phases, but at least I think that there is some very bright and beautiful in old age. For example, the new possibility for spirituality and getting away from those cynical thoughts. Of course, how much that cynicism calls you depends also from how much force you have been trying to push to your life. I think there is much of burnout in it too.
I'm not sure if this goes too far from the actual topic, but I have to ask, what would you say, since you feel that you are also hopelessly cynical in some way? How do you stay functional then?
Me?
Or in general, how does an occultist endure?
I was thinking that, of course, for an occultist, it's a little bit different, because when you are profane nihilist, you can just think that everything is going to hell, everything ends, we are all going to die, and that's about it. But when you're occultist, it gets harder, it's worse, because you can no longer believe that things will end. They can spiral down to new hells, and it will not end ever. So, of course, it's also a possibility for new hopes and new ways of thinking in these new spiraling moments. But it also means that you can get stuck to those very literal hells. So there's always like a part of Mars attached to that Saturnal mortification for an occultist. It can never be complete Saturnal blackness.
I often ask myself, like, why I chose to become an occultist. Just because it does sometimes seem a bit like a catch-22, in the sense that what gives me purpose and a constant striving to be a better person holistically also damns me in that way, where it, the suffering never ends either, in theory. But that being said, I don't think I did necessarily pick occultism. I think it just is. But yeah, sometimes I take a really deep look at it and I just think, I could just not believe in this stuff. I could just go back to being a teenage nihilist, and maybe I'd be happier for it in some way, or just kill myself and believe it'll end there. But that's not an option right now, so, or ever.
It's also both scary and a bit funny to think that maybe we are here because we were cynical people who ended killing ourselves and are now back to the beginning. So if we believe that death is not the end, but there is a cycle of reincarnation, like actual occultism has to think, I think, then we are all like results of our past, both mistakes and accomplishments. And of course there must be mistakes, or we would already be adepts and masters who are no longer facing these difficult questions, but only answering them.
Something that you, Polyhymnia, said made me think of one of my points in my notes here regarding how, for example, religions are often blamed for being just ways to escape fear of death. And I've even thought about myself, that could my practice be also just that? Might I be falling in that same trap? And we can think that in like spiritual life in general, there is this trap of quote-unquote easy answer to kind of escape the challenge of death by focusing on some kind of an idea of afterlife. But even if we believe in rebirth or reincarnation, we can still say that this life as it is unique, and it's going to end in its own way and so forth. Do you have ideas on that?
I think that the natural tendency for people is to not confront death, and to kind of lean towards that easy answer out of fear, because we don't, what do we know about death? Really nothing. Like, from a materialist point of view, we don't know anything about it. Even from an occultist point of view, we interpret what we think we know about it, and we apply it to our spiritual natures and how we conduct ourselves. But ultimately, it's the big unknown, in this life. So I think the tendency for our own closure's sake, like it all comes down to closure, is we need to know. Or the tendency is we need to know. It's a lot harder to say, you know what, I don't know, and I'm okay with that.
And even if we take the other point of view and think about life as one triangle and death as an inverted triangle forming this hourglass of being, then they are just reflections of each other, and very death-oriented occultist or spiritualist will face that great unknown in life, because both of these are something that we can't fully define. Whether we are fearing death or life, whether we are wanting to escape either of them, we will face that great unknown. It's the great mystery. And I think even for someone who has, let's say, lost one's own life and is somehow facing that bardo state of post-mortem consciousness, for him or her, it's still the great unknown. What is happening to me? What am I going through? What is this? When we are doing all kinds of occult tabulations and even like more poetic descriptions for these, they can't grasp that subjective feeling that the mind goes through when facing the mysteries of both life and death. I have used in several occasions the citation from the book of Job that says that thus it is the day's work we are doing, and our days are like the days of an hireling. This was the form I took that to my Unseen Fire article, and the meaning is that as human beings, as beings who are alive right now, we have this particular moment to work for something, to reach for development and spiritual advancement and helping others. When we die, we are cut off from this land of action and facing something that is more subjective still, something which is unable to create any more positive impulses for other people and ourselves. And that is of course true even if we are profane people and think that nothing will follow the point of death. But also if we as occultists think that we will be born to another world that is inside of us and helping us to go through our spiritual things, in good and bad, we are cut off from the rest of the world at that point for some time. And I think that's the great difference between the esotericists and exotericists in religions and New Age circles, because these latter people might think that when they die they can still affect this world as some kind of ghosts or angels or ascended beings very easily. But I don't believe that. I think that death is kind of like a gateway to another kind of existence. And that's what the Book of Job meant, that we are servants and we must do our work now when we live here. Especially because it's not easy. It's part of the challenge.
You mentioned the unknown, which made me think of change in general and how like any action of change can be seen linked to this mystery of death. And actually from that comes to mind also what you said earlier about life and how in these such fundamental dichotomies, these things always intertwine in the sense that we can't really talk about death without talking about life and God and Satan and all those. Basically, one cannot just choose one, but like both sides are included in the same package and in each other, and those seeming dichotomies always kind of dissolve into each other.
I would even claim that it's the mark of true esotericism that they are both taken at the same time in discussion. Even if people claim to be interested in magical worldview and occultism, if they try to choose just some part, I am for God and against Satan, or I am for death and against life, they fail to grasp that we are living in this great unity of spirit and matter, and that is the core of occultism, in my opinion, to understand that we can't have a personal stance in life that is absolute, or all kinds of personal stances are like aspects, phases. They have to be changed in that great operation or the great work that we will go through in our trying to become true adepts and grasp the reality as it is, and not only in some way that we would like to see it.
Yes. And coming back to the death is change thing, I might have said on this podcast that my kind of own spiritual journey in a way started from Zen Buddhism, and from this one thing that has stuck with me among many other things is this idea of small deaths kind of happening all the time, and that's one of their like explanations for rebirth also, that like every instant we die and we are born again, and there's something useful in that, I think. Then could it be said that then like this, if everything is change and everything is death in a way, then what happens to us when our body dies and our soul is scattered? Then it's like just a more intense change somehow.
You mentioned Zen Buddhism. So I don't know much about Zen Buddhism, but I have a friend who is a Taoist, and he talks a lot about like non-attachment. And is that something that's found in Zen Buddhism as well? Like, could that be something that, I think one of the questions you had asked was, you asked it in the memo, you haven't asked it in the podcast yet, but was how one deals with the concept of death, like how you deal with loss and grieving. So would like something like non-attachment be an answer, like according to Zen Buddhism, for kind of dealing with that loss?
I was thinking like from a completely different, opposite angle when I was thinking that when you mentioned small death, I was thinking about sex. And so there is this connotation of a positive orgastic feeling about that metamorphosis that is smaller or greater death. And I at least wait for my own death as a kind like a sexual act of being finally released. So definitely that change can be seen as something that releases a great tension when we have put so much in our effort to become good enough human beings to carry the title of an occultist. It creates this great amount of stress, and I think it's possible that death as a metamorphosis to something freer can also mean release.
Speaking of this non-attachment and grief and loss, it must come to me personally from that kind of Zen era that I've kind of tended to think that this ability to let go is very important, at least for my temperament. Also, like, I could say that I come from a materialistic background, and a big part of my occult journey has been the deepening of the understanding that we are more than our bodies, and we can't trust our physical senses too much, and all that. Like, that is like where I come from. And in that sense, this ability to let go has been something that I feel like I still practice, of course. And it feels that as everything does change and die in the material world all the time, this ability is very important. And we should somehow face and accept our own death and the death of those close to us. But still, we shouldn't be indifferent either towards death in general, or death of any individual being. And like, how could you balance this as an occultist or as a spiritual practitioner of any sort?
I think I mentioned in a previous podcast that I had been around quite a bit of death, and one of the biggest ones was like my dad's death when I was 14, and so I feel like I struggle a lot of the time with kind of just like discounting death. Like, if you are exposed to it a lot, and especially in the last few years, I don't know about you guys, but like, I've lost a lot of friends and acquaintances over COVID, just from like oftentimes addiction. It's most of the time been addiction. So a lot of overdoses and suicides. And at some point I just caught myself just being like, oh, there's another one. Or, it was only a matter of time. Like, so this kind of almost apathy just from repeated exposure to the same pattern with the same end, right? So, yeah, I find that I have to balance that in myself to not reach that point of indifference, and to remember that there's that it's sacred, that life is sacred, and that the death is sacred, and to remember to honor that and honor that person. Because when I really think about that thought process, I'm deeply ashamed, because it's so tragic. But and I think that it is also a reflection of kind of a desensitivity that we see even in general within our culture at the moment, like our social climate. It's very easy to become desensitized to those things. And so it's a constant struggle to muster the empathy and to remind yourself to not become desensitized to things like death.
Our culture has failed in its attempt to deal with the problem of death in many different ways, and that's part of the basis of our empathetic problems, because there is no longer sacredness in death, but we still face death in its like very macabre and violent and meaningless forms, and that can lead to experience where our feelings of empathy are seeming fake. They have something fake in them because they are projected by this society, which only claims to feel that sympathy towards people who have passed away in violence or too early, or because of some very bad personal choices. It would be easier to see the meaning in death, I mean both the positive meaning and negative feeling, if our culture would give us some kind of instruments for that. I chose the sixth principle of our Star of Azazel to be the worship of death, because I thought that we no longer face either the positive or the negative aspects of death in our life. And especially for our, Finnish culture, where death is somehow tidied away to some places where old people die, and we never see them going through those processes of failing health and death. I think it's become too sterile, and personally I would be, I think, terrified of those physical aspects of death. I would find them disturbing to be with, like, elderly people who are very, very sick and about to die or very ill. But at least these things should be discussed. There should be some kind of cultural stance, and not only that tidying away of things.
Just to kind of touch on that, have you mentioned like violent death? My background is in mortuary sciences. I had done a couple of years for that with schooling, and so I've embalmed people, and I've seen quite a few dead bodies in that way. And I think that it's often very easy to kind of conflate suffering to the point of death with death itself. So especially in those like really violent actions, like death is what happens, right? And it's the cause tends to be like extreme suffering or extreme stress that eventually ends in death. And I think that really gets confused sometimes. Like some people will just equate death with suffering every single time without thinking of the nuances that, I imagine there are some deaths that aren't painful or violent. Well, not imagine, I know for a fact that some deaths aren't violent. And so they aren't a process that ends abruptly. And even witnessing, like the first body that I had seen was somebody who had died in a violent gunfight. And I remember, not the very first dead body I'd ever seen, but within the context of school. And I remember opening up the body bag and going into complete shock because of the scene that I was witnessing, which was quite gory. And how that was so much different from, handling the body of somebody who had just died of a heart attack in their sleep. So I think that element of suffering changes the whole dynamic of death and how we perceive it. It's a lot easier to think of death as this like abstract concept than it is to think about the attachment that a violent end adds to it.
For me, it has always been very strange to think how it's common to think that death is somehow painful or violent or disturbing itself, because I have always thought that death is the antithesis of suffering. Like, of course, if I would die today or tomorrow, probably there would be a great deal of suffering in it, but the death itself would be released from that suffering, or at least the physical aspect of that suffering. Maybe I would suffer in some post-mortem state, but that's a different thing. So is it intuitive for you to see why culture always seems to think, at least claims to think, that death itself is violent or even unnatural somehow?
I think it comes down to the fear of death in a lot of cases. So since we don't really know, and you hear, especially in like the media, of all these like horrific things and wars and accidents, and we seldom hear enough good news to kind of balance out the horrific news. So I think death becomes something that we naturally fear. And I mean, especially in the West, where I would say that in the West, we're completely like death phobic. We don't have a very good understanding or want to understand death. Even when I was in funeral directing school, one of the biggest things that we were taught was like closure, the psychology of death, and how, people should have an open casket, or they suggest having an open casket so that people could have closure. But I was thinking about that because funeral homes, even if you go on their websites, they'll say, an open casket gives you closure, but they don't really go more in depth. So if we don't, as a culture, embrace death and in a way that we don't fear it, then how is saying, look at this person who you loved who just died dead in this casket, what does that do beyond giving you the closure of finality, like, oh, they are dead? How does that help you move past, like beyond that? All it is showing you that they actually died physically. right? So coming to peace with that, coming to terms with that, we don't, as a society, at least here in the West, support those constructs that help somebody grieve in like a healthy way.
Would you see it positive if we would have some kind of more physical bodily experience with our deceased, like Tibetan air funerals where people are dismembered and given to vultures, or some kind of mummification and presenting those bodies? Or what do you think? Personally, I find it a bit disturbing, but I think it's a partly temperamental thing.
I was just reading an article by David Metcalf about the Barawan tribe in Indonesia and how they participate in like a form of endocannibalism by essentially, don't get grossed out, by essentially like drinking the fluids, like liquefying the fluids of decomposition and consuming it as part of the process. So I don't think that that is necessarily something that I would personally be okay with in my grieving process. But I can also respect that, you know, that culture got to that point of thinking that, and we could probably meet somewhere in the middle between how we in the West here react to death and that. Like, I don't necessarily think that sky burials or anything that it doesn't need to be gruesome. But I think it's probably more in the conversations that we have, in the way that we talk to our children about death, and the way that we explain death, just being transparent about it, and even talking about it more. And there's like a tendency to kind of romanticize death when it is spoken about, right? You have a lot of those artists, and I'm one of them. I like, death is my favorite concept with which to art, as it were. But that's not super accessible either. Like, that kind of art tends to be more niche. So I think that it needs to be a whole cultural upheaval and acceptance of just death itself. So not necessarily sky burials, but just more death acceptance, less death phobia.
It also seems that it's about empathy more than about like what actually happens in our cultural presentations. I have known Satanists and people who are very interested in this kind of black aesthetics, who are very fine and eager to find beauty in those kind of macabre things, but they are still far from understanding death when it comes near to themselves or their loved ones. They can be very different things. So I heartily agree that it should be about discussing things and finding our like soulful connection to those things, and not about changing some visual aspects, aesthetics in culture. They are of secondary nature. Or what Beshiira thinks.
I kind of still was thinking the question that you had about like culture and violence in death, and I'm not sure if I would see necessarily the violence like by default in that way that we see death, but definitely this death phobia. And it reminded me of what I read from the Phosphorus book earlier when writing the notes for this episode, from the Necrosophia book, literally Love of Death, about this like horrific phase of death and decay and all that. And one idea from there I took was that it is precisely because we are so deeply identifying ourselves with only our material selves, and like that's all we think we are. So that's why it appears so horrible. That's why we want to hide it. And if we just could see kind of the bigger picture, like the grief and the loss and all that, it wouldn't disappear, but it would appear to be something larger.
That brings to mind that idea from the Bardo scriptures from the Tibetan Book of the Dead about how when the deceased person sees these black demonic entities, black divinities, like eating brains from the skull cup or doing these kind of very, very scary black things, one should understand that they cannot hurt him anymore, or they are not about hurting him at all, but it's about the projection of one's own thoughts of fear and unfamiliarity and neurosis that take their presentations as these kind of images. But of course it's a bit different when we are alive and facing other people, and when there is some possibility of actual wish of harm, when we are facing true adversities, whether physical or mental, it is a kind like an objective evil to us. So when we have passed from this life, we should be happy that everything we experience are projections and part of our own being, and they cannot be violent because they are part of ourselves. Of course, this once again depends from that basic view that after death we are facing subjective and not an objective world. Perhaps people who would believe in some kind of Christian heaven or places like that would disagree with me here.
I'm actually curious if I can ask, because I mentioned like the West's view, but I mean that's so broad. What is a funeral like in Finland, like a typical funeral?
We are very Lutherans here, so most of us belong to the Lutheran Protestant Church, at least nominally, and the very reason the people often name is that they want church marriages, they want church funerals, and they are quite bleak, empty rituals, but pretty much the same for everyone. There's this closed casket and sad hymns that are played with organ or something like that. It's quite grey.
Yeah, I think technically cremation is more and more common nowadays, even might be the most common, I'm not sure, but the closed casket is there in any case in the funerals mostly. And of course there are like Orthodox Christians who have open caskets, and from the little experience and knowledge I have of that, I could say that their approach to the whole issue of death is a bit more healthy, with their emphasis on the like remembrance of death and all that, which as such is lacking from the Lutheran credo, but that's a minority anyway.
Do you guys have any like Baptists over there?
I don't think I have ever met one, so basically no.
Sure there are, but like
yes.
Marginal.
I wonder if that's like a North American thing here, but if you ever are here and there's a Black Baptist funeral, I've been to a couple and they are the most joyous events. There is a lot of clapping, there is a lot of singing, there are choirs. It's really something. It's like a celebration of life. It's definitely, yeah. I was just thinking about that. I don't think you guys probably don't have that over there in Finland. It's something that we have here, and it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and actually in my travels I have seen something like that. In some cultures it is exactly as you said, like more like a celebration of life, to the extent that, for example, in some parts of Africa it's common that you can have the actual corpse like on a chair and people are dancing around. And again, maybe not my cup of tea, but I can understand that there is something that maybe we haven't quite understood about the whole thing.
Well, here we have wakes as well. Not every culture over here, but some cultures participate in wakes. And I think like a wake is kind of a nice middle ground between what we were talking about, like endo-cannibalism, and then just like very death-phobic practices. But wakes where, you're with the body for several days, like the body will be, I was at a 3-day wake where the body was just shrouded, and then people would go up and pay their respects, and everybody was drinking and drunkenly go talk to the body, and it's surrounded, like the body is surrounded by their favorite foods and things like that. So I've participated in things like that, and by the third, like the first day is kind of weird, but then by the third day, like you're like, okay, let's bury this guy, like I'm sick of you at this point. It's fun. It's like a fun way to approach death.
That's a great way to take that psychological leave, that one gets tired of the celebration. It's pretty ingenious, actually. From wake came to my mind those many folkloristic Finnish stories about how one is being alone awake with a dead body, and it has been used, for example, as a form of taking wizardly powers when one is alone with the body and faces the fear of the body. And often in these old Finnish rituals there is something to be done with the body, being in close contact with a dead body, and with that it was thought that one gains the power of mana, or the collective death energy.
Finland is a magical place. That's not something that we have here.
It was, but I think the past 100 years have made us just some sad Lutherans here. But maybe there's a spark there still going on.
Yeah, it's also very kind of witchcrafty, the old tradition that we used to have, and shamanistic, of course. But yeah. Speaking of witchcraft, what you just said kind of reminds me of like the reverse phenomenon of what the Tibetans traditionally do when you speak to someone dying, or I guess someone already passed, and you try to help them to kind of move along in the afterlife. In the Finnish tradition, you want to gain something for yourself then.
Of course, in every culture there are these downward path and upward ascending path practices. Even in like Indian practice, there is this. Have you heard about the ritual when one mounts the corpse once again alone and waits until the corpse in that particular ritual starts to fight back to you? But you have to subdue the corpse and take the power from it. It's pretty dark. And pretty insane also, of course.
Yeah, I realized I maybe used the word witchcrafty in a bit demeaning way, but you know what I mean, basically.
No, I didn't take it that way. I think it's like if one polarity is in those tamed Protestant religious practices, the other polarity is in witchcraft that can be either ascending or descending witchcraft.
What do you think, how far should one go to this kind of death meditation, in the sense of kind of facing the gruesome face of, say, physical death?
That's one of the things that I have faced as being the very good aspects of the Star of Azazel, that I have met people who have opposite temperament in these things and whom I can really appreciate. We just talked with Brother Obnoxion, Sodalis Obnoxion, who has pretty much the opposite view about the body and hence also about the bodily death than I do. And I find it invigorating in a spiritual way that he can find fascination about those bodily aspects of death and other kinds of very bodily things that in my temperamental stance seem like gross or fearful or something that I have to fear, or if not fear, I find some repulsion instead of attraction towards them. I just had a dream where I was carrying this brother's ritualized corpse with me. He had given it to me as a sacred magical object, a talisman of sorts. And first I was like completely neutral with the thing that of course I can carry this neutral death talisman with me. But when the dream advanced, it became a nightmare. The corpse began to stink and I felt more and more horrible, even though the object itself was sacred and given in trust and love. I faced that macabre part of death, which is horrifying to myself. But I think the heart of this story is that there is always that magic, whether we are attracted to it, whether it fascinates us, or whether we fear it. That bodily aspect of death is full of energy of its own sort. It's kind of like a satanic power. And I am happy that I have friends and brethren who can appreciate this bodily aspect of death. Because if I would only have friends who are like me, I would end up being a neurotic and most likely would distance myself more and more from these things. But now I understand that these two are beautiful things in their own way. So I think it is about your own temperament. If you want to go very deep to that kind of bodily meeting of death, you can of course do it, and it can be sacred and holy. But I don't think that it's necessary. I also think that you can get a more abstract stance towards death as long as you really try to understand it in its core and just not to escape it. Because death is both bodily and spiritual. One can't claim that you cannot understand death if you have not spent a night with corpse. It's just simplification that comes back to one kind of temperament, just as its opposite.
Death meditations are something that I've struggled with even kind of understanding. And I've been asked that before by other brethren, just kind of what death meditations would entail and if I've done them. And I think that any death meditation that I've done has just been trying to go so deep inside myself. And it's funny because when I was younger, I used to lay there and imagine what it would be like to be dead, like all of the time. And I would even try to convince my mother that I had died, which is terrible. I got her once when I was probably about my daughter's age. I think I was 9. And I remember just laying there and pretending that I was dead. And then and I was stopping my breathing or slowing it down. And she was ready to call 911 and she was crying. And then I was like, boo, right? And that's horrible. But so I think about that in those moments, that fascination with death and what it might feel like to die. That's kind of how I understand death meditations in that way, is like trying to think about what it would be like. But it's impossible within this consciousness, I think, to even capture what it might be like.
When I was in my late teens and early 20s, I was completely fascinated with necromancy and like bone remains of people. But even in those times, I would have been terrified if I would have seen like the putrefying corpse of human being. For me, it's very different to have these bones that have already given their organic substance and are like clean, for me, spiritual instruments, like trophies for conquered life, so to say, and something completely different to see flesh that's been dying and eaten by worms. I had this very strong urge to open graves and get bones for myself to use, or not so much to use, but to just reach and find these like last remains of humanity. I think it seems to be quite common, at least in Finnish Satanist circles, to seek this kind of personal death experience via other people's remains. So many of my friends have done something similar.
A question about the bones. Would you feel that the method of death impacts how you feel about those skeletal remains? Like if it was, like if a known violent death, would there be some kind of extra negative energy attached to the remains?
Yeah, absolutely. One reason why I never wanted actually to have those kinds of remains is because I believe that there is somehow connected the magical substance of the deceased person, and that can almost never be completely neutral or positive kind, but there is also some kind of karmic and problematic union. It would be different, I think, in some culture where one's connection to those remains would be more natural, but since here it would be almost a violent action to get to those bones, I think it would create kind of like a black magic effect, almost necessarily.
There's Thai amulets, and they contain like spirits of the dead. It's actually really interesting to kind of observe. But the amulets will sometimes be advertised with like very specific deaths. Like it'll be like young woman died in car accident, or and I'm not sure if it's like the idea is that the spirit will then protect you from calamities in that way in this amulet. But I just thought that was really interesting. I wanted to buy one, but my mom forbade me. At 36, my mom forbade me to buy this amulet because we're from Thailand, and she said, absolutely not. Don't bring that into your house. So it's interesting to think about. I don't think that I could. Like I did want to buy one, but I don't think I could actually have it in my house because I would just feel like it was just a lot of negative. Like I don't know. I couldn't ever make peace with it.
Now I can hear in my ears when the Satanists who are among our listeners listen to this and say, well, black magic is exactly what we need to do because we are Satanists. But I guess here we can say that it's the sort of downward atmosphere that isn't really helping in our work.
I would say that the great difference here is about, are you actually connected to these things, or is it a kind of like aesthetical choice for you to just gain some personal pleasure of being dark? Because I can see myself having this kind of amulet or skull or something that would have the energy of someone who had been actually close to me. But if it would be just someone I had never met, I know from nowhere, and I would just gain hold of his or her essence, it would felt like great violence against that spirit, that essence. It's not in my hands. I should not hold something that doesn't belong to me.
That's a very good point. I think that I feel the same way. Like if it's, I think I mentioned in another podcast too, that I have a hard time, like death for me is just, I think about it all of the time. And it's probably from my experiences in my youth with death. But it's impossible for me to separate reality from death. It's just, I'm always thinking about it. And I think that if, like, say if I'm not going to go dig up my dad, but say if there you were able to do something like that and have like a finger bone or anything like that, I think I would be okay with that, because, you know, you loved the person or knew the person or were affected by the person in life. And so for me, it would only be good energy having something like that with me. So I'll be expecting your finger post-mortem in the mail.
I was just going to say that one of my, one could say, fantasies about the Star of Azazel would be to have like my own skull being somehow preserved in the grand lodges, to be kept as an artifact there. But of course it's mostly symbolic thing. But I could easily think about it as a physical thing also. But to think that my skull would be on a shelf of some trophy collector, black magic market keeper, it's pretty different. But yeah, of course, my parts are yours.
Maybe we could take an underlinedly more occult point of view. We have talked about these lower and higher selves quite a lot. Lower being our personas and material manifestations, and higher can be then our soul or inner master, or how would you best describe it? How is death different from those kind of different perspectives?
I think that we can choose our world to think about death, but the question is pretty much the same. We can't think that in case we have this inner, in a way, immortal ego, that it would be just some kind of extension of our feeling of self, that some kind of bank that we can put our personality in and then it gets like immortalized. That would be like cheating the original question. It would be the same kind of mistake that the Christians and other believers in heaven do. I think even though I believe that there is this kind of higher monastic being, lucifer-christos, the master within, I must understand that that entity too, from my perspective, will die. For example, in the way that how my personality will cease to be as it is when I die, also that inner master's higher kind of individuality will cease to be when that presence gets reabsorbed to God or divinity or something. I mean that the basic question is about giving up our wish to be eternal as we are. And when that is being taken care of, only then we can start to understand these like larger spirals of smaller ego and larger ego, and perhaps even the greatest ego in all, that is God. But it's very difficult question, because at least for me, giving up is almost impossible. I can say that I am giving something up. I understand that this belongs to the past, but part of my mind is always grasping that past. It's extremely hard for me to get past the lost romantic relationships, for example. And so I keep thinking, what will I face, for example, when my parents die? Shall I keep somehow grasping them, or am I able to fully understand that loss and things like that?
About these monastic selves and monadic selves also dying, came to mind Stula and Linga Sharira once again, these Sanskrit terms used in theosophy and also in in old Hindu philosophy, and from some Tantra I remember reading that the etymology of sharira comes from some root meaning to decay. And I started to think that in the context of linga sharira, because I can very easily understand, of course, the decaying of sthula sharira, our physical bodies. Well then, okay, if this decay is kind of, it's already like by default included in also the more subtle body of ours, then what is that? It has to mean that it also somehow dies. But yeah, I think that's a good overall answer to it, that it kind of, as soon as we kind of climb those ladders of spirit, it demands some kind of acceptance of any current state dying.
Have you read Bulwer Lytton's Zanoni novel?
No.
I think it faces this kind of question because it depicts adepts, master magicians, as like very fascinating personalities who have all these kinds of immortal and magical abilities and are like superhuman in many aspects, but that they too have to, very similarly to our standard human beings, to face that choice to give their lives freely and face that like deeper kind of mortality. Of course, it's very like almost clichéic thing in these adeptic depictions, but it's, I think, good practice to think that would I be so willing to die if I would be actually happy and holding these magical powers? It would be so much more difficult. Of course, I am ready to die because my life is suffering, but if it wouldn't be suffering, it would be a very different kind of question.
I think it's easy to think about the end of suffering as death. Like that just seems to be where the brain goes. I know that for me, suicidal ideation has been a constant theme in my life, and it's too easy to go to that place for me. Right? Like it could all just end. The sun could die out and we could all just die, or an asteroid could hit us, and how wonderful that would be. But I had a cancer scare a couple of years ago where they found spots on my liver. And this was after my MS diagnosis. And so I had, been pitying myself about that. And so when I had this cancer scare, I was actually really freaked out. And I had this moment of like mortality where I was like, I don't actually want to die. So I always try to bring myself back to that point, because it's so easy for that pattern to reinstate itself in my head where I'm like, I feel awful. I want to die. I just want to kill myself. But no, when it's actually maybe happening, I think that's always the case.
I actually use that same thing as a practice. Almost every day I think that now I feel bad, but if I would have just received the word that I am going to die tomorrow for sure, how would I feel about living this day? Because it helps to get past all those neuroses and focus to the, well, it feels wrong to say the positive side of things, but like an energetic life side of things.
These discussions and the higher and the lower self, and also their intertwining and how this kind of letting go in a way never ends, brings to mind again our SOA Tuesday celestial hymn. This part where it's in Latin and it says Quoniam occisus eset redemistinos Deo in sanguine tuo, meaning the God who was killed and redeemed us with his blood. And in the commentary it said that the God who was killed can be seen as God being born into the physical world, and then the redeeming us with his blood then means that with his sacrifice he raised the human personality from the mechanical repetition of unconsciousness. And how these different selves kind of meet here. My higher self can be seen dying and that is like giving birth to what my lower self is, and then there happens kind of another twist, another sacrifice, and then we are redeemed. If I think of my higher self in a karmic way, in a way, I do all kinds of stupid things here on earth, and then my higher self in one way or another kind of cleans my mess. You can see that in a way as like redeeming of sins, meaning that this higher self is still at the same time me, and that gives a new kind of an angle to the whole, like the question, what is to redeem something? And that all happens in me. I cannot kind of expect some outer master to do it, but at the same time I am the redeemer and I am the one being redeemed. And then how does this like relate to death, when at least it can like give new light to the whole setting of life and death? And like that is, as we sometimes talk of Christ in me, or lucifer-christos, the higher master in me in action, and that's in a way one means to kind of transcend what we have thought death is, for example.
Also, it made me to think that when we as occultists think about death, we can fall to these kind of snares to speak always about like metamorphosis and transformation, and it doesn't ultimately mean much if death is only some kind of transformation. But if we take the another aspect of death as inertia, something being closed to very small place, almost unable to do anything, I think it's apt way to see this redeeming process, like this Redeemer, Christ, Lucifer-Christos, or Avalokitesvara, or Buddha, is in a coffin of our personality, like imprisoned by Saturnine death aspect. So it's death as lack of movement, lack of freedom, lack of energy, being close to grave.
Which somehow also makes me think of time, and it may be too a vast subject to go into, but at least it can be mentioned that again the whole idea of life and death changes if we think of it not from a linear time perspective, like how these are not like this happens and then you die and then you become something else, but how that is true, but at the same time esoterically we can see that those also like coexist, so to say, at the same time.
When we were speaking of redeemers and the theme of redemption, it's, you know, like our fifth point, like every man is his own savior. That's the thing that I am constantly, when people are asking me, you know, why theistic Satanism, that's the point I constantly return to. Because if you're not going to save yourself, right, like who is? So I think that's very important, to constantly perpetuate that life, death, rebirth cycle in an act of saving yourself.
Should we move on to mortification?
I was actually just going to say that sounds like a great work is in a way a big cycle of mortification in itself, because if we are redeeming ourselves as Satanists, we are practically decaying from our old being, our petty being, and like very, very slowly becoming something that is hidden inside this bodily casket, something more glorious, something more real. And it can't be done unless we let those petty feelings die.
Yeah, actually I remember thinking sometime earlier that, oh shit, I haven't had this full like mortification process yet, and I have to now get it in order and whatnot. And then I thought that, okay, these mortification periods come in cycle, and of course they do as things intensify from time to time. But then what I realized later on was that it's not really about like going through a phase of mortification, but exactly as you said, the whole work is mortification, and like that is a deepening process more than, okay, now I have done this, I can move on to something else. But that's like the whole thing, pretty much. At least that's one way to see it. And what is mortification then? Okay, I would argue that it's pretty universal idea and ideal again, that you can find in pretty much all the spiritual paths worth following, to put it bluntly. The idea of dying while living, and then being born anew or born from above, as it's, for example, said in the Gospel of John. But like if you had to try to summarize it somehow, what would you say mortification is, and what is its aim, and why is it so important?
I was thinking that answer to that has been the very point of our discussion all the time. So I think mortification is about accepting death in all its ways, but it can take so many different points of view that our temperaments give to it. So, and of course we must accept also parts of those that are very unnatural to us, when we feel that there is some kind of truthfulness also in them. I think it's also about humility, because we as Satanists can be quite proud and hybrid human beings, and mortification is about letting those things go. So not only understanding that this flesh, this body will rot, but also that my ingenious mind will also rot, and it is very mortal and very small compared to real spiritual hates of adept masters and divinities and the great unity of being. So I think mortification is understandable to those human beings who in their hearts already understand that I am something else, I am something more, and thus this envelope, this sharira or eggshell that people see when they look at me and read me and think about me, it's something that is about to fall off sooner or later. It must change. It's good that it changes. And I think the process of not being the egg anymore and becoming the bird is about the great part of becoming an adeptic being.
Do either of you have any thoughts about like passive mortification versus like an active, deliberate mortification, like seeing something within yourself that needs to be essentially expelled and effectively like killed out of yourself to kind of advance things? Like, so say for truthfulness, right, you would have to like kill the tendency to lie within you, and that would be like a deliberate act. But then not, of course, like finding that balance there too, because one can be too honest as well. But would you consider that type of action like an active form of mini mortification?
You said kill. I remember that I have had like by default positive attitude to like killing as a symbol in spiritual work, but I realized that more and more it sounds like, well, forcing first of all, but also something maybe instrumental, in the sense that, okay, you see there's something you want to change, then you kind of tackle that as if like trying to cure symptoms instead of the actual what's causing those symptoms. So I'm not sure if I'm like a white aspect person at the moment, but I can see that white kind of tendency in me, that I tend to think that if my focus is right, if I actually strive and do this work consistently, then this kind of more detailed things kind of start to heal, if that's the right word. Again, I don't know, but by themselves, in the sense that I don't, of course I have to, like, if I see that I do something wrong, I can just like let it be like that, but killing certain things you don't like about yourself like shouldn't be the first focus, I guess.
I have thought about this a lot because I have too struggled so much about all these practices about killing oneself, killing one's bad habits and supposed negative aspects, because it's the usual language in the sacred books and occult books and so on. But I think that the problem is in that we no longer have those guru systems, those systems where one has an actual teacher, because I believe that it's the teacher who helps the student to applicate those teachings. The teachings themselves are pretty harsh. They are the red aspect, so to say. But the teacher is the white aspect. So he or she helps the student to understand that yes, this is the path you are going to take. This is the actual teaching and it's correct. But this, on the other hand, is how we are going to do it. And it works with love and taking yourself into consideration. Of course, it doesn't have to be this way. There can be harsh gurus also. But as a large big picture, I think we would need interpretation help with these old tantric and magical and sacred texts to see what is the line between us doing harm to ourselves and our process by that spiritual violence, and where that so-called killing is actually beneficent.
I think that says a lot about my own temperament, that I go to the place of like total self-punishment every time. Like, this is problematic, this needs to die. But I think historically I'm pretty hard on myself that way, so it really isn't surprising. So I appreciate your guys' perspectives on that for sure.
Yeah, well, likewise, I'm exactly the same, and it's not like something I'm good at, but
for me the challenge seems to be that even though I would like to treat myself with silken gloves, so to say, there is this very Luciferian Satanist subconscious, or maybe subconscious is a bit wrong word, but there's something inside of me, some like Satanist magnetism that tries to invert the things to violence, some kind of inverted pull. And it has been very, very interesting and also horrible to find those depths of our soul that tie us to those like also negative mortifications. Also in the phases I would see it no longer necessary, but we have that devil inside tied to our being. So even if we would stop trying to judge ourselves so harshly, it's possible that the process itself is not ready to go as quickly. At least in my life it hasn't been.
Yeah, and I guess that white ideal, like focusing on the core, whatever it then is, until that is reached, you must like tackle more specific things more, of course. Like that's also like part of the process, that it's again climbing a ladder kind of thing.
I know for myself, I think that the tendency to want to kind of attack is just an attempt to make any kind of movement that like even chaos feels more comfortable than being just uncomfortable. Like the state of being uncomfortable in something when you're transitioning, or like for the past several months I've been in a state of extreme discomfort, and I know that it's been a constant struggle to try and think. My brain always goes to what am I doing, what's wrong with what I'm doing right now, what needs to die within myself. But I think at some point the person has to just let the processes happen and unfold and accept it as a part of the larger work, even if it's just uncomfortable. And that sucks.
Also, one thing that's not too much discussed, I think it would have to be discussed more in also the spiritual occult circles, is the human tendency to become masochistic. I see it quite often in the occult pupils that we have this kind of psychological snares in us that make us love a kind like downward pull. And it can be seen also in mortification processes, especially in the black aspect pupils, that we think that we are punishing ourselves to reach for something greater, but actually we are punishing ourselves to get psychological masochistic pleasure. And it's not spiritual at all. I'm glad that we are step by step going further from the old Christian and Judeo-Christian problems in this, because as you most likely know, in Christian mysticism the masochistic tendencies were glorified. Martyrs were thought about as saints and so on. If you die of your self-tortures, you become like an angelic being, and that's of course the opposite of the truth. If you torture yourself to death, you become a demonic being who is also doing great spiritual harm to other beings. But I say that we as occultists should always think that, am I punishing myself for some like perverted pleasure, or because I really am trying to reach for something that would make me better and help better the other human beings or other spiritual beings or the whole.
Which I think then opens the conversation up to kind of like asceticism. Like, how do you guys see fasting and things like that, the deliberately withholding aspects? Do you find that, like, how does that fit in for you?
In Argarism, I took a quotation from, I think it was Bhagavad Gita, where Vishnu or Krishna says that those who are torturing the elements in themselves, they have the demonic nature, meaning that those yogis who fast too much, who make other kinds of like physical punishments for themselves to reach spirit, are not actually spiritual but azuric demonic beings. And that doesn't necessarily mean in this context only a negative thing, because in Hindu scriptures demons are like higher beings than humans in some ways. It can be great to become empowered by this kind of azuric demonic dynamism, especially if we are in some way phlegmatic in nature, somehow more than necessary tied to our bodily being. But we should not think about it as a spiritual practice. It's more like a mental neutral practice. And I think that's one good way to think about fasting and being physically awake for longer periods, or doing sports in great measures. It's not good or bad, it's just a neutral instrument.
I've never thought of fasting as something demonic, but now that you put it like that, yeah, I can see that. I have had very positive experiences with fasting, and precisely because of that kind of focus shifting, that you like emphasizedly try not to focus on material things. Like you eat as much as you kind of need to be like content, but you don't do it in excess or something like that. And if I've had a few weeks fasting, usually they are not very harsh, and it doesn't have to be like ascetic. There might be time for that too, but like usually it doesn't require that harsh measures to like orientate right. And usually I haven't done it actually in some time, but I've had very, very good experiences with those kinds of things. But then again, the kind of white aspect tone in me would like to add that again here I could see a kind of a outer manifestation of something that we can also kind of ideally do less visibly. I mean, actually it might be the Azazel prayer book even when it says the prayer to Azazel. Is basically a fasting hymn, so to say. And in that it said in the commentary part that our whole life should be in a way like fasting, but it doesn't mean that we should be like materialistically ascetic all the time, but our focus should be right. That's basically as I see it.
Yeah, it was originally a prayer made to these fasting times before major rituals, and only afterwards I understood that why not use this all the time, because it tries to give the mind that focus it should have all the time, and no outer process is demanded with a prayer. I think that fasting should be taken as a rule, similar practice as with puzzle making of sorts, as a focus of putting our mental energy in, because especially nowadays in our superficial culture, when we all have these stresses how we should look like and so on, letting go of eating, taking less food can also be a form of very superficially making yourself more beautiful and putting more focus into that. Of course, I don't say that it's like that to all people, but it's so close to the cultural wounded points that for most people I would instead suggest some kind of like more mental focusing than what's done with food or even sports, even though it's very good to have a like healthy temple for the spirit. It's too easy to start focusing too much to that outer side. So at least there should be some kind of fully abstracted fasting process with these outer fasting processes.
Yeah, that might be the big mistake of like Western monastic traditions, for example, that they have only this one thing basically, and the different stages of that, like deepening fastings and so on. But it's like pretty ascetic all the way for all temperaments. And
yeah, although if we think about monasteries of the Middle Ages and so on, they had this cultural emphasis also, like how they copied books, art pieces and so on. So maybe we see it one-sidedly also. And nowadays monasteries of course are more about fasting and less about making art or copying esoteric books.
Speaking of fasting and the likes, I heard in some like Catholic contexts and probably elsewhere as well, people can speak of like smaller mortifications, exactly like everyday life things, like abstaining from something little, not taking that little like treat, you know, that can be a little mortification. For example, giving up a certain food or drink or habit or whatever. But then also there is this deeper process, which John of the Cross has, for example, called Dark Night of the Soul, which is like mortification in a deeper sense. And in his book, he basically talks about how a spiritual aspirant is purified of his mistakes step by step by going through darkness and going through spiritually dry times and all kinds of hardships, and then through that darkness he eventually comes out of as something new, basically. And you spoke of humility, Johannes, earlier, so that gives me a good reason to quote Saint Francis here, also a Catholic mystic, from his Canticle of the Sun, which is a very beautiful prayer, by the way. In the end, it says that, "Braced be you, my Lord, through sister death, from whom no one living can escape. Woe to those who die in mortal sin. Blessed are they she finds doing your will. No second death can do them harm. Praise and bless my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility." This is thoroughly Christian lingo, of course, but that's a good summary of this process, I would say. Like, for example, the part that no second death can do them harm, because, well, the whole idea of death has kind of changed.
And also, speaking about different deaths is quite esoteric thought, not so much exoteric profane Christianity, since the Christian idea of the second death comes from Revelation, and the Revelation itself is quite alchemical, Kabbalistic, occultist scripture. We can understand how this kind of like inner death, soul's death, is something that is important to us as spiritualists and occultists, and is something quite poetic and non-understandable for a profane Christian. Like the very idea that someone's soul could die is something that no Christian could speak about, even, well, of course, if he's evangelist or prone to these kind of very high kind of sermons, of course he could speak about these things, but not as normal Protestant Christians.
Like in general, maybe I'm trying to find something to say about this mortification, especially so much because of my own background, which I said is like basically materialistic, and how I see this mortification process, and a concept that is related to that. I guess it's Greek originally, this metanoia term, meaning like a total change of mind, total shift, basically, from my point of view, for example, from materialism to spiritual reality, like an actual full shift. And that's why I see that this mortification process is so important. And maybe it's also our time that I see it like a requirement in a way for spiritual striving.
Yeah, like the Gospel of John was mentioned briefly before, and quite near the beginning of the said Gospel, Jesus speaks with Nicodemus and says that those who are walking this spiritual path have to be born anew from above. And I think the metanoia, that is nowadays pretty much, I think, a Christian term, has been taken from the Platonic, Neoplatonic Greek, because that thought, that Neoplatonic thought, was very much present when the new Christian theology, dogmatism, was made 2000 or little less than 2000 years ago. I think the metanoia, or the getting past our small mind to nous, or spirit, or great gnosis, is kind of like a beacon or turning point or antithesis for the standard mortification, in a way that in mortification we are seeking something that in metanoia happens, like reversing the polarity of the bodily understanding.
Yeah, and speaking of that, as well as like differing temperaments and differing methods being useful for different types of people, one thing that is an ever fascinating concept for me is this kind of white mortification. The idea that the same thing can be achieved and this same kind of first death or dying while alive can happen via vivification or life, like the fullness of life, and going into that so deep that the whole thing kind of turns around.
If we think about what happens in nature, if the growing power in seed, small plant becomes intense, it will break through concrete, and then the birth of that plant is the mortification of the concrete, and there's nothing sad about it, even though it's death.
And like from a human perspective, what happens in both or all these different ways of the same process happening is relying on spirit, and then what might seem to us to be like darkness, like a void or a vast space, why not, then is eventually what brings us to new kind of life.
I think it's a good question. I don't think I have any semblance of an answer. I know that at the moment I really feel like I'm kind of in the middle of a dark night of a soul myself, so I'm interested to think about what the next steps might look like. What I like to think that I'll be able to emerge out of this like some kind of butterfly from some kind of horrible dank cocoon, but I don't know what the next steps might look like in terms of that. I'd like to think about looking at other people and examples and to kind of see. But at this point, I feel like in this dark night of the soul, I've felt mostly mad, like not angry, well, angry too, but like virtually insane, touches of insanity. And I think that at that point, it's right now the struggle is to not go down the path of descent. It's making that conscious choice every day to try to ascend and hope that, you know, I make it out the other side as somebody who has the tools to continuously ascend more. So any insight you have as to what that might look like post would be awesome. Because right now it's pretty bleak, these dark nights of the soul. There's not a lot of hope to be found.
Of course, there are always exceptions, but my strong belief is that as a culture, as a Western culture, global culture nowadays, we are actually living through so intensely hard and even we could say apocalyptic times in a way that for people who are sympathetic, empathetic, subtle, spiritual, it means a horrible collective stress. It means insane amounts of also hard to deal with energetical stress. And so we shouldn't be hard on ourselves that we are feeling bad all the time. We don't have all the answers for ourselves or for humanity. We are suffering spiritually, psychologically, bodily, emotionally, because it's a collective problem for our culture and it's extremely stressed right now. Of course, there's always possibility for everyone subjectively to reach for the light, to reach the point where this mortification becomes spiritual vivification and everything is white light. But I think it's 1,000 to 1 or more that it actually is about feeling the great suffering of humankind and the animal kingdom likewise, and the whole planet. We are going through such a terrible time that in a way there has been no such time before. And of course we will go through it, the humankind, the planet will live through it, but so much will change. The humanity has to change so much that we are actually collectively dying right now and feeling the death of the collective humanity in good and bad.
Yeah, I don't feel like I'm in any position to give any insights, because I'm struggling with the same things, probably very different kinds than you are. But yeah, as said, John of the Cross speaks of like spiritual dryness, like in the sense that you don't get any kind of gratification or any kind of joy from your work, but you still do it because of some kind of what's the word in English, like duty, velvollisuus. You do it because you have to, and well, that is work for you. Something you do because it has to be done. But it's like personally very hard when I'm feeling very down, for example.
It's a bit of a cliche to say that in the Kali Yuga or the Black Age, the process of spiritual development is fast. But we can understand that when there is only the feeling of dharma, of doing what's right, and there is nothing good to be felt with it, or in those days, in those times where there is nothing to it, it is extremely quick to just choose the pure spirit with no gifts, nothing that you can actually gain with it. You just have to choose the doing what's right because it's right, even though everything is black and you know for a fact that it doesn't help. We are in a way touching God's heart at those times, touching the very fabric of reality where there is only the energy, only the power, and humanity has fragmented. But luckily, of course, that's not the whole truth. There will always be good things, friends, and things that help at least partly to see the process as also something that helps other people. We have talked about things that are hard and perhaps repulsive in a way, but also the bright side of occult development and occult way of seeing things is that the fear dies ultimately. Even if we think about possibilities like death of planetary life, death of humanity, death of animal kingdom, like these extremely black, bleak possibilities, as occultists who deal with the very abstraction of death and utter change, we come to see that in the end there is nothing to be afraid of. And I don't mean that we can rest assured that we will live on as spirits, but more like that whatever comes, even if I would cease to exist as a body, as a soul, as a monadic spirit, as an occultist, I have come to understand that even such a void would be nothing that I would have to fear. There is like complete spiritual structure even in that utter void, and in some way that is very hard to explain or put into words. One starts to feel unity with that utter aspect that's beyond every kind of death, and feel assured that there's nothing to be afraid of.
Well, I often think about how easy it would be to, be a person that accepts an external source of redemption. Like my mom is very Christian, and whenever, she's like, oh, just lean on Jesus, right? If you're sad, whatever, just lean on Jesus. And I just can't be that kind of a person, but there are days that I really wish that I could, because there's this blissful ignorance. Not saying that my mom is ignorant, but it's like a willing ignorance, right? That to kind of just accept that there's some outer redemption and there's a reason for all of it. But I think that what separates us as occultists is the want to kind of sit in what feels uncomfortable and what feels dark and what feels terrible, and like you said, continue to try rather than just leaning on external sources.
In that novel Zanoni I mentioned earlier, there is this story about the magician aspirant who opens some kinds of clairvoyant abilities in himself too early with aid of some alchemical substances, and suffers a terrible tragedy that he is still feeling as part of the world, like not fully spiritual but a mundane person, but he's already seeing and hearing these spiritual things that are not fully a part of his life. And I think that's a tragedy of every occultist in the making, that we are beings not wholly in the physical world and not wholly in the spiritual world, but like outcasts from both worlds in a way. That we can't close that door that those Christians have been able to keep shut. When we have seen that, okay, it's not like this, then you can try to tell yourself that I believe in Jesus and I lean on him, but it will never be the same. You just can't unsee the spiritual reality where there is no easy dichotomies, no easy dualism and easy evil Satan to blame and easy loving God to worship.
Thank you for listening. More at theserpentandthestar.com.